Okay, let's look at example 6. It says the formula h equals negative 16t squared plus 48t plus 160 gives the height of an object thrown from a building 160 feet high with an initial speed of 48 feet per second, where t is measured in seconds. Factor this formula. So the 160 and 48 are in your formula already, and all we're doing is factoring this. So remember, the first step is always to pull out the GCF, and when I'm dealing with a t squared, I want to pull out this negative. I don't want a negative in front. And it happens to be that the GCF of these three terms is a 16, so I'm going to pull out a negative 16, which remember means I'm dividing all three of these terms by negative 16. So when I do that, this first term becomes t squared, the second term becomes negative 3t, and the last term becomes negative 10. So that's the first step. Just pull out that GCF and do that division. Now that I've pulled that negative 16 out, it has to stay there. We're going to factor this quadratic. So always start with the parentheses in the first term, because we know t squared, we have to have a t and a t. And now you're looking for two numbers that multiply to be negative 10 and add to be negative 3. And at this point, we can do this probably without writing that table, because these are pretty small numbers. So two numbers that multiply to be negative 10, add to be negative 3, would be a negative 5 and a positive 2. Those two numbers multiply to be negative 10 and add to be negative 3. So that's factored. Okay, example 7 says a company earns a weekly profit of P dollars by selling X items according to this equation, and we're going to factor it. So again, the first thing we need to do is pull out the GCF, and I don't want a negative x squared, so I'm not only going to just pull out a 2, I'm going to pull out a negative 2. So when you do that, we're going to divide all three terms by negative 2, and I get x squared minus 50x plus 5,000. Okay, and now we're going to factor this. So draw your two sets of parentheses, and you need two numbers that multiply to be 5,000 and add to be negative 50. So first of all, whoops, I'm sorry, that should be a negative 5,000. I didn't put my sign in there, because a negative 2 divided by 10,000 is a negative 5,000. Okay, so that makes a little more sense. So when we're trying to find two numbers that multiply to be 5,000 and add to be negative 50, we know our signs are opposite. And so if you're having a hard time with a large number like this, you can write out all of the factors, but for 5,000, that could be a lot. So you could also get out your calculator and try and start dividing. So first of all, 5,002 is way too small, so you could divide by 5. And there's no way 5 and 1,000 add to be, in any way could be add to be 50. So you can take 5,000, divide it by 100, and you get 50. So that's a good indicator of two numbers that would work. 100 times 50 gives you 5,000, but we need a negative 5,000. So you have to, from here, you can figure out which one would need to be negative in order to add to be a negative 50. And that means the 100 would need to be negative. So you'd have x minus 100, x plus 50. Those two will multiply to be negative 5,000 and add to be negative 50. Okay, now just 3 tips from what we just looked at. And the first one is when C is positive and B is positive, so that one we have like x squared plus bx plus c, so we don't have any negatives. You probably saw that that meant that both your factors are positive. Just write that. So if you have bx plus c like that, if both of those factors are positive, then you know that when you factor it, both of your factors should also be positive. Okay, the other one is when c is positive and b is negative, so that would be x squared minus bx plus c. Remember we said then that both your factors have to be negative. That's the only way you can multiply to be positive and add to be negative. And then the last one, when c is negative, so b could be either positive or negative, but when c is negative, your factors have to be opposite signs. That's the only way you can, that should be an S, that's the only way you can multiply to be negative. So just be careful with your signs when factoring.